Hello everybody and welcome to Blockchain Expert. In this video, I'm going to be discussing ledgers. Now, ledgers are important to understand because really what a blockchain is a ledger. Now, of course, it's a bit more than that. It works a little bit differently and it has some specific properties. But at the end of the day, the goal of a blockchain is simply to keep track of all of the different transactions that have occurred on a specific network and for you to trust that ledger, for you to trust the history and the log that it's storing. So I'm going to start by just walking you through a very basic example of how people may use a ledger. Then we'll talk about some security issues and concerns with that and kind of how the blockchain may fix that and some properties of the blockchain. So for this example, we're going to have kind of two people or two actors. Now the first one we can just call Bob, and the second one we can call Alice. Now, whenever we do kind of Web3 or crypto examples, we usually use these two actors, Bob and Alice, and just excuse my kind of crude handwriting and illustrations here, just for the purpose of teaching, right? I'm not trying to be an artist in front of any of you. Anyways, we have Bob and Alice, and let's imagine that Bob and Alice are friends, and frequently they loan each other money. Now, of course, if a lot of different loans are going on, or they're paying for each other, or whatever's happening, it's going to be hard to keep track of, and they probably want to set up some type of system where they can track that. So what they would do, likely, is have some piece of paper, or have something that they would refer to as a ledger. Now, in this ledger, they would just track all of the transactions between them. Now, I'm just going to kind of denote Bob here with a B and Alice with an A just to make this a bit simpler. So let's say that maybe on the first of the month here, Bob decides to send Alice something simple like $1. Now they want to keep track of this, so what they would do is they would go to the ledger and they would just write in an entry. They would say B sends A, and then they would just write the dollar amount here of $1. Now maybe the next day, Alice decides to send some money over here to Bob. Maybe this can be $2. Same thing here. You'd go in the ledger and you'd write A, sends to B, and then you would write $2. Now, let's say it's the end of the month. They want to settle up. Okay, well, you just look at the whole history of the ledger here, and you would realize that Alice has sent Bob more money than Bob has sent Alice, and so Bob owes Alice $1. And then Bob could send that, and you could write that in the ledger, right? So you could say B sends A, and then you would write $1. All right, so that is all great. And this allows Bob and Alice to keep track of all of their different transactions and who owes who how much money. The issue with this ledger, though, is that it must be trusted by both Bob and Alice. They need to really trust each other that they're not going to go in and write fake entries. For example, maybe Bob decides one day, hey, Alice doesn't really check the ledger very much. Maybe I'll just go in there and write a few entries so that I can make a little bit more money. So he just goes in and he writes Bob sends to Alice, and I'm just doing this in purple so you can see it's kind of fake or fraudulent, and does something like $10. There's nothing stopping Bob from going in there and writing that, and in fact, Bob could actually do this the opposite way if he wanted to. Now, he probably wouldn't want to do this because it wouldn't be beneficial to him, but he could write an entry where Alice is sending him money, right? Like $15. Now, in this case, they're kind of keeping track of loan balances because they're going to pay each other back, so that wouldn't be beneficial to do. But there's nothing stopping Bob or Alice from going in here and just writing fake transactions. They have to trust each other, and they have to trust the ledger at the end of the month. Otherwise, the ledger is completely meaningless. There's no point in them really using it. So that's the first issue that occurs, right? Anyone can go to the ledger at any point in time and write a transaction, and both Bob and Alice at the end of the month need to trust that the ledger is correct. Otherwise, it's useless. It has no real value to them. So with all of that said, how would we go about actually fixing this problem? How would we make it so this ledger can be trusted? Well, the first way I'm going to show you is if we were to introduce kind of an intermediary here, something like a bank. So let's say Bob and Alice, they still want to be sending each other money, but they kind of need a way to verify that. They don't really trust the ledger. And in fact, let me just move this over a little bit onto the side of the screen. They want something or someone to tell them, yes, the ledger is correct, and to not have to deal with these security issues. Well, what they could maybe do is start using something like a bank. Now, if we introduce a bank into the mix, we can put a bank like this. Now what's happening is the bank is going to be storing the ledger. So now if Bob and Alice are going to be sending each other money, they're going to be doing it through the bank. The bank is going to be recording their transactions, and the bank is going to be writing the information onto the ledger. Now, let's just imagine the bank gives Bob and Alice both kind of free viewing of the ledger. Then they can go and they can look at the ledger and they can see at the end of the month how much money they owe each other. Now, in this scenario here, the trust has been removed between Bob and Alice, and instead it's been placed in the bank. They've said, okay, we're not going to trust each other anymore. We're going to trust you, the bank, because you're a bank, and we trust you for whatever reason that is to keep track of the ledger. And then at the end of the month, you can tell us how much money we each owe each other. So this seems great. This seems fine because now the trust has been removed between the two, and it's been kind of delegated to this central authority. But as we know, the bank at any point in time could go and they could modify this ledger. So again, it doesn't really solve the underlying problem that anyone at any point in time here from the bank, anyone that controls the ledger, could go, they could write fake entries, they could delete entries, they could modify the ledger, and the security or kind of integrity here of the ledger is still compromised because it's in the hands of the bank. Now, it may be less compromised because the bank may be more secure, it may have protocols in place, etc., it may be more established, but it still doesn't solve the underlying problem that this ledger can be manipulated in some way, and that at the end of the day, Bob and Alice really do not know with 100% certainty if this is going to be accurate. Now, I know I'm putting this to the absolute extremes here. In 99% of scenarios, you can trust a bank, you can trust a central authority, again, relative to kind of where you live and the politics and all of that going on. The idea is, though, you just never know, right? And with a central authority, anything can happen to this ledger. So this is where we introduce blockchain. This is really why blockchain was originally invented, to solve basic problems like this. We don't want a central entity. We don't want a bank. We don't want one person, one company, one government to be in control of this ledger. And just to illustrate another point here, what were to happen if the bank were to burn down? Like, let's imagine this is fire on the bank and it was storing, say, a paper ledger. Then this ledger would be destroyed. It would be gone forever. It's not like the bank has done something malicious. They've just lost the ledger. The ledger has been destroyed. So that's another problem too with storing information like this in a central place or entity. It could mistakenly be destroyed. All right, so let's get rid of this example here, and now let's see how blockchain technology would actually solve a problem like this. All right, so I've just whipped up a pretty crude drawing here of the difference between a ledger stored by something like a bank versus on the blockchain. Now, I just want to read you quickly a definition of a blockchain because a ledger and blockchain are kind of synonymous here in this context, so I may be switching the words around, but first let me just read you the definition. So a blockchain is a distributed, decentralized, publicly available ledger of transactions that are verified. Now, the important part here is distributed, decentralized, publicly available. We're going to talk about verification and validation and all of that later on. For now, just imagine that that's done automatically. We don't really need to worry about that. But distributed, decentralized, publicly available. So now that we understand that, let's kind of contrast those three properties there to the bank. So first of all, it is not distributed because the ledger is stored in one single place. If the bank goes away, so does the ledger. It is not decentralized because it's only one bank that's owning this. Even if it was multiple banks owning it, still, they're all together, right? That's kind of one entity. A group of banks is still a central entity. So in this case, it's not decentralized. We need to trust some type of central entity, authority, whatever it may be. And it is definitely not publicly available because even though I might be able to see all of my transactions if I bank with a specific company, at any point in time, they could stop that. They could remove my access. Certain people are not able to view the ledger. You can't view other people's transactions. It is definitely not publicly available. It is privately held by the bank and typically very secure. Whereas we move over to the right-hand side of my screen here, and now we look at kind of the blockchain ledger, or in this case, it would just be the blockchain, right? In this situation, we can see that these special nodes, which are yellow, we'll talk about those in a future video, are all storing a copy of the ledger, or the blockchain. Now, what that means, first of all, is that this is distributed. If one of these nodes is to go offline or to disappear, even if a bunch of them are to go offline or to disappear, we still have access to the blockchain. We still have access to all of the transactions and to the ledger. Next, it is decentralized. Why is it decentralized? Well, it's decentralized because the ledger is held by a bunch of different people, and we don't need to trust any central authority, governing body, whatever it may be. A bunch of different nodes, a bunch of different essentially random people or entities are all holding a copy of the ledger, meaning, again, we don't need to trust one central entity, one authority, etc. If this guy right here, let's just kind of color this in purple, were to say, oh, I'm going to try to kind of fraudulently modify the ledger, then the rest of the network would be able to determine that because this is decentralized. All of these nodes here would say, hey, no, you don't have the same copy that I have. This must be incorrect. Ignore that copy of the ledger. We're going to talk again about how all that works later on, but that's kind of the basic premise. Continuing, this is publicly available. Anyone, like these white dots here, can go and read the ledger from any of these different nodes. And again, if this guy's reading this ledger and this ledger is incorrect, he can say, okay, I'm just going to go and read it from this node. So it is publicly available. Anyone can view it. There's no barrier to entry. And you can view any single person's transactions. You can see every single bit of history that's ever occurred on the blockchain. There you go. That is the main difference between a blockchain ledger, a decentralized, distributed, publicly available ledger, versus something like this, which would be a ledger held by a central authority or bank. All right, so I've just cleared the screen here, and now what I want to do is list out a few important properties of a blockchain. Now, again, a blockchain is our distributed, decentralized, publicly available ledger of transactions that are verified. But it has a few other properties that are very important to kind of have the integrity of the blockchain be held up and for us to be able to trust the blockchain. So the first property of the blockchain is that it is immutable. Now, what that means is that it cannot be changed. Once something is on the blockchain, once a transaction has been added, whatever it is, you cannot modify it. Cannot be changed, cannot be deleted, cannot be removed. No aspect of it can be changed. It is completely immutable. Now, mutable is the opposite. That means you can modify it, you can change it. Blockchains are immutable. Again, we'll talk about why that's the case later on, but just know that they are immutable. Very important property. Next, we already know this one. They are publicly available. Continuing, they are decentralized. They are distributed. And now we have 4 properties that we all should know: immutable, publicly available, decentralized, distributed. The next property of the blockchain is that it is chronological. Now, chronological just means everything is in order, and we kind of have all of our transactions, let's say, sorted by the date in which they were submitted or, I guess, added onto the blockchain. Now, we need to have chronological ordering so that we know what the balance of different accounts are at specific times. If we didn't have chronological ordering, that would essentially mess everything up on the blockchain because we wouldn't know when specific transactions were sent, and we wouldn't know whether or not someone would have balance to be able to send something based on the timing of different transactions. A few other reasons as well, but that's kind of the main aspect. And the last property here is that it is irrevocable. Now, irrevocable simply means that something cannot be changed, reversed, or recovered. Now, what that means is that if I send you $5, let's say in Bitcoin, that is irrevocable. I cannot get that $5 back. I can't request a refund. I can't change that I did that. I can't reverse a transaction. Once something is on the blockchain, it is irrevocable, just like it is immutable. So make sure you understand that, because if you ever do anything with cryptocurrency, anything on a blockchain network, say like Bitcoin or Ethereum, it's not changeable. It's not reversible. You can't recover it. It's done. Once it's been finished, it's final. It's on the blockchain and it will be there forever. Now, one last point I want to make here just before we end the video is that throughout the rest of this section, all of the examples I'm going to talk about relating to blockchains have to revolve around Bitcoin. Now, of course, there's many different blockchain networks. There's actually a few that aren't decentralized, that aren't distributed, and that have different properties than what I described here. But all of the properties I just described apply to Bitcoin and apply to most other standard blockchain technologies and different coins and all those things that you guys would imagine. But I just want to make it very clear that we're going to talk specifically about Bitcoin throughout this entire section. Now, we will have a section where we talk about Ethereum. We're going to dive into some other cryptocurrencies as well and some other blockchain networks. But just remember, everything from now on has to do with Bitcoin. All of the properties you hear relate to Bitcoin. Yes, they relate to most of the other networks as well. But I just want to make that important distinction because I know that there is some other blockchain networks that don't have the specific properties that I'm going to be describing. So with that said, I think I'm going to wrap up the video here. I hope this was helpful and that it introduced you to the concept of a ledger. And I look forward to seeing you in another Blockchain Expert video.